Okay, this is part two of our reading of the Master and his Emissary, which is 30 pages every week, 2 weeks, whenever we get to it. And this was the first 30 pages of chapter two. But Macy took the honors of doing a synopsis of what it looked like last week for the first 30 pages, which was the intro in chapter one. So, Macy, would you like to take it away?
Okay. This may be like long. I apologize, but I feel like it's good context in terms because for people who are watching. So in the intro, Ian kind of goes down checking out the structure of the brain and perhaps understanding the structure of the world in which the brain and body mediates, the importance of why they're divided, the hemispheres, and why they're asymmetrical. He speaks about the importance of how the hemispheres differ, stating, "It is not just that I believe there to be a coherent pattern to these differences. That is a necessary first step. I would go further, however, and suggest that such differences help to explain aspects of human experience and therefore means something in terms of our lives." He talks about how there's a bit of a power struggle between the hemispheres, two fundamentally opposed realities, two different modes of experience between them. Both participate in function and experience. It's not one for this and the other for that. Um, Ian is not trying to deal with what the brain does, but how it does it. Not just functions, but ways of being. I'd say their relationship to those functions and these functions' relationship to the world. He says the most fundamental difference between the hemispheres lies in the type of attention they give to the world. The kind of attention we pay actually alters the world. We are literally partners in creation. They have different sets of values because of their modes of attention. The relationship is also not symmetrical. Left is more dependent on the right, whether or not it'd like to admit it. The brain not only mediates, brings about our experience, but shapes it too. Um, he also goes on to say that it's not just trivial, mediocre information that helps us to predict what sort of the tasks the hemispheres may preferentially carry out. Kind of like, interesting. So, like, if it's like the left hemisphere does this and the right hemisphere does that, it's not so much of a take that in as an interesting fact and then move on with your life. It's more so how our hemispheres do things determine how they look at the world, aka how you look and choose to interact with the world. You need to understand what you are so you can better negotiate who you want to be. Our brain and body are the mediators, responders, and interpreters of our experience. We are not just responding to our environment, but shaping it. And there's a pattern in how we come to shape it. How do we understand the world if there are different versions of it to reconcile? A central theme of this book is the importance of our disposition towards the world and one another as being fundamental in grounding what it is that we come to have a relationship with rather than the other way around. If the mind is at least mediated by the brain, it seems a reasonable bet that the brain will have left its mark on the world that we have brought about. The importance of being two is also mentioned, and he believes that language in the left hemisphere is not just coincidence, it's how the hemispheres are involved with differentiating themselves. In chapter one, he speaks about the corpus callosum, the band of neural tissue that connects the two hemispheres, and its function to allow the hemispheres to communicate as mainly something that he actually he sees that it seems to actually inhibit. There's also, he mentions interhemispheric connection and how it seems to be decreasing over time, actually. So as the hemispheres are, I guess, evolving, they're not communicating, actually. It's not as interconnected as it once was. In chapter one, Ian addresses the way the two hemispheres question by highlighting the importance duality in refining control. So, aka he's trying to figure out why is there two hemispheres in the first place, and he thinks that there's an importance in duality in refining control, almost like when you're trying to move an object, you have to use a bit of pressure that not only pushes but also restrains. He speaks about the frontal lobes and having a major role in what makes us characteristically human. He says the defining features of the human condition can all be traced to our ability to stand back from the world, from ourselves, and from the immediacy of experience. We have to inhabit the world of immediate bodily experience, the actual terrain in which we live, and where our engagement with the world takes place alongside our fellow human beings, and we need to inhabit it fully. Yet at the same time, we need to rise above the landscape in which we move so that we can see what one might call the territory. He sees this as a necessary distance between ourselves and the world we perceive. Distance, thanks to the frontal lobes, can teach us to manipulate and use, but it can also teach us to empathize and trust. He also mentions brain asymmetry and that they are not equal in either side. The disproportionate structures may have to do with function. So in this book, he talks a lot about how structure can relate and tells a lot about function. So an idea as to why they're not symmetrical is it could have to do with how they differentiate themselves. So taxi drivers in the book, as an example, have a larger right posterior hippocampus, the area of the brain which stores three-dimensional maps in space, because of their job, the thing to which they are attending. This plays into how Iain does not think language was developed in the left hemisphere because of chance. Firstly, it fails to account for the expansion in the right frontal lobe, but also it may have to do with the mode of attention of the hemispheres and how they interpret and interact with the world. On the one hand, there is the context, the world of me, just me and my needs, as an individual competing with other individuals, my ability to peck that seed, pursue the rabbit, or grab that fruit. I need to use or to manipulate the world for my ends, and for that I need narrow focused attention. On the other hand, I need to see myself in the broader context of the world at large, and in relation to others, whether they be friend or foe. I have a need beyond that to see potential mates, potential enemies. Here, I may feel myself to be part of something much bigger than myself, and even existing in and through that something that is bigger than myself. This requires less of a willfully directed, narrowly focused attention, and more of an open, receptive, widely diffused alertness to whatever exists with allegiances outside of the self. So that plays in really well to chapter 2, which is what we're going to be talking about today, which is it plays a lot on the nature of attention and how what you are attending to, what one brings to bear on anything, alters what one finds. So yeah, that's my little summary.
It's good.
Am I in the Hall of Mirrors?
Yeah, I was about to ask everybody, what did you think after experiencing the first dialogue? Do you think that was an overall good encompassing synopsis? She got everything covered, and
Yeah, I think so. I like how you said that we need both different types of attention. We need the overall attention of the right hemisphere and the focused attention of the left. I think a lot of people could come away with the message from this book that the right hemisphere is good and the left hemisphere is bad if you're not reading closely. I don't think that's a good takeaway or what he's trying to get at either.
Yeah, I think that he's trying to set the stage more along the lines of how to understand which part of your own mind to trust. The right hemisphere is more trustworthy about the world that you actually have to navigate, and the left hemisphere has an unbridled certainty of that which it cannot know. And when this manifests in ourselves, this is when we present the more untrustworthy. So it's not so much the dichotomy of a good or an evil. It's more about understanding your blind spots are primarily from the left hemisphere. And if you're not humble enough to recognize that, then you're going to find yourself making a lot of errors, coming to incomplete conclusions about very important world topics.
Yeah, and that's a reflection of what's going on in the consciousness too, right? Like all this stuff is expressed externally. It's not like you can say, oh, I want to turn my right hemisphere on or my left hemisphere on. It's more like almost this seems like a philosophy searching for a neuroscience explanation, which is an interesting way of going about it. But we also have to realize that this is not something we can consciously control, but we can control our outlook on the world.
Yeah, and anytime the hemispheres are communicating back and forth and attending to the world, the communications are like microseconds upon microseconds. They're very, very fast. So it's not like you can say only one hemisphere is attending 100% entirely, because it's still communicating to some degree back and forth and giving the other hemisphere information. And unless you're a split brain patient, you have two hemispheres acting at all times, which we'll get into split brain patients in this chapter.
Yeah.
Good segue. That was a very good segue. And I suppose I'll start by screen sharing the PDF. And then the suggestion was last time everybody goes around and just gives the page that they were either confused about or interested in. I know Cyril will have one for me this time because I gave him homework. Okay, so I'll just pull it up here. This is the first 30 pages of chapter 2. Can everybody copy this?
You betcha.
Okay. Carter, do you want to start us off with a page?
Sure. Where am I going to go here? Oh, this one was interesting. The differences in sameness. Left hemisphere, not only are they like to lump everything into one category, they can also lump one category into everything, if that makes sense. So what this guy is noticing, I'll just read the whole section.
Well, what page?
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, it's starting on page 53 at the bottom.
This is a really good section, bro. Good job.
53. 53. Okay, I'm scrolling. Okay, and you said it was the end here?
Right at the bottom of page 53 it begins, and then it goes over to page 54.
Okay. So right here?
Are you actually just going to go to scroll back a bit there, Madison? I think you're talking about the differences in sameness. You're going to start right from that segment.
I'll start at the couple paragraphs into that segment. It starts with fascinatingly right hemisphere deficit.
Oh yeah, copy that.
Yeah, there it is,
go.
right there.
Yeah, we're lined up.
Yeah. Yep. Fascinatingly, right hemisphere deficit syndromes can result in something which looks like the opposite. The belief that someone one knows is duplicated in different places at different times. Not, in other words, the division of a unique whole, but the mass reproduction of one. Something personal and usually alive has been duplicated as if it were a mere item on an assembly line, according to John Cutting, with loss of uniqueness and familiarity. A patient of mine accused her husband of two-timing because she believed she saw him on several occasions with different women while she was out in the town shopping, at times when she knew he should have been at work. This curious condition is called Frigoli syndrome, after an Italian quick-change artist of the early 1900s. Here, the fine discrimination of individuals supplied by the right hemisphere is lost, and different individuals are lumped together and again represented in a category. It is not the opposite of the Capgras syndrome, but a natural consequence of the same cause, a loss of the sense of the unique whole. Such delusional misidentification applies not only to people, but to objects. Another patient of mine began a vendetta against someone who believed had entered her bedroom and subtly changed all her clothes for copies of a slightly inferior quality. It can even apply to places. One individual held that there were 8 imposter cities duplicating his own, and said he had spent the last 8 years wandering between them without finding the real one. There were also 8 duplicates of his wife and children, each duplicate living in a separate duplicate city with a double of the patient. I don't know if you guys have ever read Calvin and Hobbes. There was one strip where he was trying to clone himself, and that's what that reminded me of. He had all these duplicates running around, except this is like played out in real life when people have right hemisphere brain damage. So I guess it's not only what the point of that would be was it's not only breaking a unified whole up into parts, but also applying the parts to the whole in a very extrapolatory fashion.
Yeah, I think for context, I want to read this part too, because when I first read this, I mean, there were 2 different ways of what you just said. It wasn't as simple as, oh, they saw multiples. They also talked about, I'll just read this section here because this gives one of the syndromes, and then you read Frigoli, which is the second one, and both of them, I understand if you hadn't really understood the hemispheres, you would think these are two separate syndromes coming from each different hemisphere, but they are both coming from damage of the right hemisphere. So do you want to read it, Carter? Just the first two paragraphs here, or do you want me to do it?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Okay. The contrast between the differing worldviews of the two hemispheres is brought into focus in a remarkable way by the issue of sameness and difference. Again, seeing their handling of these as just different comparator functions in information processing misses the point. They are not functions within a world we already know to have a certain mechanical structure. They are themselves part of the foundations of the world in which we try to understand them. An individual could be seen as a little universe, an infinite number of serial moments, experiences, and perceptions, as the left hemisphere would see it, which are, of course, at least as far as the right hemisphere is concerned, a single whole. Your wife or husband who left the house this morning may be in a different mood or have a different haircut by the evening, but this doesn't present a problem of identification, because these separate slices of experience, these separate frames of the film, as the left hemisphere would see it, are not really separate at all. They are the different aspects of one unique whole. But with certain right hemisphere deficits, the capacity for seeing the whole is lost, and subjects start to believe they are dealing with different people. They may develop the belief that a person they know very well is actually being represented by an imposter, a condition known after its first describer as Capgras syndrome. Small perceptual changes seem to suggest a wholly different entity, not just a new bit of information that needs to be integrated into the whole. The significance of the part in this sense outweighs the pull of the whole.
So when I hear that, that reminds me of, betrayal. When somebody gets betrayed, cheating, for example, in the Frigor's syndrome, one thing goes wrong that you think you have the carpet pulled out, and then your entire world is suddenly different. And then it's really the left hemisphere that now has to remap because it thought it was somewhere. But then its little piece of paper that is 2D got ripped in two, and it's not understanding the right hemisphere's version of the world, which is actually everything outside of itself, because its 2D piece of paper map got ripped in two. It now thinks it understands absolutely nothing about the world. Whereas in this case, you can't, because these patients actually have right hemisphere deficits, but people who are just functioning in the normal world, me, Carter, we can experience some betrayal, but if we ping to the right hemisphere, or we're conscious of the fact that our left hemisphere would react this way in a scenario of betrayal, it would think that it has to remap the entire world or look at the person as an entirely new entity, whereas it's really just a scenario, a piece of the puzzle that is happening in a bigger context, and the world is still occurring around you. And then maybe remapping wouldn't be so difficult if we would ping to the right hemisphere.
Or pause long enough to get past the effort principle, because that essentially is what happens. The left hemisphere engages in frustration and anger at the map being basically, think of it like an Etch-a-Sketch, and now it's lost, right? Because it got shook, and then it's got this damn blank slate sitting in front of it. And so it's, when like kids, when they're in that underdeveloped stage, because at first they start out of the gate with the right hemisphere doing a lot of growth, and then they go into the left hemisphere, which is usually where the terrible 2s and 3s enter into the equation. The frustration with, I'm never going to get it right, and then it's the effort. And that essentially is because the left hemisphere it can't map. It literally requires more data to come in. Otherwise, then the temper tantrum and screaming on the floor and pounding the carpet and all of those human things that we do end up being sort of the order of the day by the left hemisphere, until some time goes by, and then you get to reflect on your temper tantrum, i.e. right hemisphere integration. and then context enters the scene, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have a little more of an understanding of why I responded the way I did, why my spouse or the person that I felt did this thing to me, and then then the nuances of the story flood the map, right? It's kind of like the whole yeah, you might have a 2D map, but it doesn't change the contour of the mountain that you need to climb. Like it can tell you that there's a mountain, but you physically got to do the thing. So yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's okay to react to your map being torn up. I'd say for people that claim to have no reaction, that's just another form of denial that your map was ripped up. You have to be able to acknowledge it and let yourself have whatever emotions you happen to have or whatever reaction you happen to have to a point, to a moderately healthy level. Obviously, if it overtakes your whole life, then that's unhealthy, but you got to expect it as well.
Okay, do we have a volunteer for the next screenshot, or shall I nominate another individual or a page number? Something that was either confusing or just stood out. I got tons too.
Is this real page 33 or your page 33?
33 according to the actual page number. Having said that, how can one make a start? One method is to study subjects with brain lesions. Right, this is to compare the differences of how to actually see which hemisphere is predominantly active with certain things, because as we discovered, both hemispheres are active in pretty much everything, but one usually leaves a little bigger of a fingerprint. This has certain advantages. When a bit of the brain is wiped out by a stroke, tumor, or other injury, we can see what goes missing, although interpretation of the results is not always as straightforward as it might seem. Another is to use temporary experimental hemisphere inactivations. One way in which this is achieved is by the WADA procedure, most commonly carried out prior to neurosurgery, in order to discriminate which hemisphere is primarily responsible for speech. This involves injecting sodium amytal or a similar anesthetic drug into the blood supply of one carotid artery at a time, thus anesthetizing one half of the brain at a time, while the other remains active. Another way is through transcranial magnetic stimulation techniques, which uses an electromagnet to depress, or depending on the frequency, enhance activity temporarily in one hemisphere, or at a specific location within the hemisphere. In the past, a similar opportunity came from unilateral administration of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. It was then possible to ask the subject to carry out specific tasks in the knowledge that one hemisphere was inactivated for about 15 to 20 minutes following treatment. So this covers ways that we can actually differentiate, because although he's trying to keep your the whole in context, that each hemisphere does ping regularly, like Kyle alluded to, milliseconds between the two. This gives us enough of a database to actually see that certain hemispheres do have different imprints on the world. I thought that was really cool, especially with the frequency relation.
Sure. Let's go back far enough too to consider the fact that when these types of experiments were permissible to be done, where they're actually cutting the corpus callosum in order to help with like schizophrenia or epileptic patients, because that was a unique tactic. This type of mapping can also be weaponized. And this is something that should also be considered, because once you start to understand magnetic frequency adaptation, penetration, and manipulation of the brain, you can start to hone in. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that certain nefarious individuals could see doing this to help enhance social engineering outcomes.
I thought about that too because right here it says depending on the frequency, enhance. So you can use the frequency to either depress and hinder activation of one hemisphere to isolate the other, which is kind of the context of which he's talking about here for some people trying to see the function of the hemispheres. However, when we understand even the music industry today, that they have actively chosen a frequency, a hertz that doesn't enhance our mental function and our bodily function, and rather it depresses it. So considering the context when you go into the big world, that stuff is super impactful because you can take a frequency and you can, which they've done in our music, and they've lowered, in a sense, and hindered our ability to think better and to resonate with one another. Because even the truth is a resonation. I mean, that's a form of enhancement, I would believe, because it has this thinking and then connecting with one another. But there are so many plays between what they have in the food, maybe, and then what they do with the water, what they have in the air, and what we listen to, music. All of that is really messing with our mentation. So I thought that was a really good scientific little, like you said, it's exposing a little bit of the oligarchy's plan. Okay, Macy, is there a screenshot that you had in mind, or a section, a page number, I should say?
Sure, let's go to 43.
43. You know, it's really funny because that was also one of mine. This is great.
This is in the force.
So this is like, we'll get into it, but it's funny, there's context kind of surrounding it always. But I was thinking of, like, well, as we were reading this, I also remembered that we were reading on the part of abstraction, and the left hemisphere very much deals with this realm of abstraction, whereas the right hemisphere kind of deals with actually what is. So it's funny because when we were talking about the betrayal type of syndrome, the first section that Carter brought up, it was reminding me of abstraction, because it's kind of like it is quite literally like you're looking at people or relationships, and you're putting it into like this outside of yourself product that you can like pick off a shelf, and you understand, and by pick off a shelf I mean in stasis. It's just this thing, and this is what it's made up of, and this is what it is, and this is what it will ever be. And that's why I found it so funny, because abstraction to me, I think, plays into why the left hemisphere does this thing in the first place, because I'm trying to understand how its functions can lead it to these ailments. So I think that might be a reason as to why it does this thing. But Maddie, it is just before the hierarchy of attention. So actually a bit. Yep. Okay. This, funny enough, Dad, plays into what you were reading us the other night. But so I'll just read it, and I guess we'll go from there. So I'm gonna read off your screen, Maddie, so you're gonna have to scroll for me.
Could I have screenshotted a matter of things? I didn't.
Oh, that's okay. Actually, I lied. I have the book right here, so I'm just gonna go to the page. Okay. I mentioned that new stimuli led to release of noradrenaline in the right hemisphere. Most neurons fatigue, that is to say, they cease to respond when continuously stimulated. These what do you say that?
Noradrenergic.
Thank you. Neurons do not fatigue, however, but maintain their condition of excitation, so that exploratory attention is held open across a greater expanse of both space and time. The range of the right hemisphere is further increased by the fact that it has a longer working memory, and so is able both to access more information and hold it together at any one time for longer. It is capable of bearing more information in mind and doing so over longer periods with greater specificity, which also means less susceptibility to degradation over time by memory. This broader field of attention, open to whatever may be, and coupled with greater integration over time and space, is what makes possible the recognition of broad or complex patterns, the perception of the thing as a whole, seeing the wood for the trees. In short, the left hemisphere takes a local short-term view, whereas the right hemisphere sees the bigger picture. So to me, I think that plays in actually very well to what we're talking about again with the betrayal phenomenon, because I was thinking about this, and the fact that the right hemisphere is able to store information longer over sustained period over longer periods of time means that it has sustained attention, which Iain talks about as well. He talks about the different types of attention in this chapter, and he talks about how the right hemisphere is able to, I guess, will quite literally sustain the information, almost like when I'm reading this book.
Vigilant is the word.
Yes. But as I'm reading this book, right, it's like I could look at it and think, I'm going to have to read this like so many times in order to retain it. You know what I mean? But there are some people, my father, who will read like something like this work and be able to retain so much of the information because he has right hemisphere sustained and vigilant attention, right? Better than I do right now. But but I think that the reason why that's super important is because it's this sustained attention and this open to whatever may be is quite literally what the left hemisphere does not do when you see that condition where there's a right hemispheric deficit, and then it decides that, oh, I guess this person has been replaced by an imposter, or there's so many of them that they've been replicated. I think that also something that struck me as important, if I can get back to the page, is the memory factor. So give me a minute here. Right, so it's working memory. So this helps it recognize patterns, right? So I think that it's tricky because you can recognize complex patterns about an individual, let's say. And when the left hemisphere did its thing where it was like it thought that it had a grip of this person, is it to say that it recognized the pattern that the right hemisphere gave to it, and then it latched on thinking that that was it, like that was the only way that this person could ever be presented in the world, instead of just being a person overall? And then that's why it was like, oh no, they've been replaced. Like I think that might be what happened, but how about that? That's a good question. What is memory?
Continuity of context over space and time of lived experience shared between the hemispheres.
Okay. Then I'd say that what he's describing with the left hemisphere and right is the right, when its ability to have that sustained attention over space and time about its experience with the hemispheres and being able to recognize broader patterns. I think that when you shorten your attention span, because what's the opposite of sustained attention? Shortening your attention span, which is which hemisphere's realm and domain? It's the left. It's the left hemisphere's realm to do focus attention and narrow things down. He talked about it in the book, and it's like the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where the harder you try to focus in on it, what is the word I'm looking for, or what was that thing I'm trying to remember, the more that you start to lose it. And so I find it funny that it's like when you almost like focus in so much, you lose that context, that continuity, and then that almost makes you, it's almost like you're prepping yourself to be bad at memory, hence remembering things. So then when you meet a person that's like constantly forgetting, maybe it's because their attention span is not very good at being sustained. But yeah, so that was mine.
The left hemisphere likes drawing human beings as stickmen. Just also to bring that in mind is that some of the reasons why that you get that multiplicity of, oh, it's a representation is the left hemisphere is looking at human beings in mechanical mannerisms, whereas when it reaches for something specific to remember about a person, it then gets lost. It gets lost in the plethora that make up an individual, because an individual has so many unique dynamics. I don't, if I recall correctly, he also makes mention about like cars, for example. You know, you can sit back and say, yeah, car's got an engine, car's got doors, car's got windows. And it's like, yeah, but that was just the left hemisphere describing bits of what cars has. But as an overall performance, there's a big difference between a Volkswagen and a Ferrari. So when an individual starts going, I have a whole bunch of this one person that's being, like in the case of the Capgrass incident or the Fergoli incident that was talked about earlier, this is a condition where the left hemisphere is literally searching for the stickman analogy, because that's the best representation of the individual that it can come up with. But unfortunately, it's incomplete.
Yeah, and it's sad because even relating to what Maddie brought up and how you were talking about how there's some nefarious people who can use those tactics. That's what psyoping and nudging is. It's like we are literally in a generation where we are setting ourselves up for left hemispheric modes of attention, because literally they're not allowing us to sustain our attention, or actually we're not allowing ourselves. Like things like if you're just scrolling on your phone and you're doing your I guess for females it's their form of masturbation. Then you're only holding your attention span like every 30 seconds, and then you're waiting for the next thing of interest to just pop up for you, and you're not actually retaining anything. It's literally a cult of interesting. Like
they're counting on you to fail yourself. They're counting on you to fail yourself. That's the psyop.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, I was just saying that it's like a problem of culture being promoted to shorten attention span by pursuing delay, or not delaying gratification. You're pursuing instant gratification and trying to get that dopamine fix. And when you get into the anatomical bits of this book, you actually find out that the left hemisphere is actually the primary center for your dopamine response neurons. So your left hemisphere actually responds more to dopamine, and your right hemisphere responds more to neuroadrenaline, which also helps with your experiencing of the new things. And so when you're scrolling or, gaming and getting all these instant quick fixes of dopamine and happiness, you're just reinforcing the behavior that the left hemisphere would like to enact upon the world, because it's dependent on the dopamine in a way that the right hemisphere isn't necessarily.
I like that you brought that up, because even with that relates to, might have been Macy, but they brought up the fatiguing of those neurons. It's like the neuroadrenaline that doesn't fatigue, because the stimuli of nuance and new things, well, I mean, that's all life is. That's our experience. We experience new things all the time, especially as we grow with age, as we meet new people. So that, that response has to be fresh, so we can be prepared to experience whatever comes our way, which is the mode of the right hemisphere to be able to take in everything all at the time. Whereas the dopamine in the left hemisphere, that's not its function. It's meant to do a positive feedback to encourage you to do certain things. And then if you remain there, that's why scrolling on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, it can keep you there, and you get a dopamine hit with a new thing every, like Macy said, 30 seconds. And then another thing on memory is that with that, the reason why conversation is so important, and me and Macy were talking about this, is if the right hemisphere is sustained attention and the left is more narrow attention, when you scroll, you don't share that. Once in a while, you'll send a meme to somebody, and even that is you're exercising sustained attention, where you take something you've learned, something you've looked at, and now you are sustaining it by sharing it with another person. And when it comes to talking with people, you can read an email or an article, but unless you, again, consciously take that and then talk about it, sustain the knowledge within your head, and that takes active attention, which is the right hemisphere, you're not going to remember it. you feel really good about this health article you've read, but you can't remember it the next day. And that's because you didn't tell anybody, you didn't talk about it, you didn't think about it more. And that's the same thing with movies. You could sit down and watch a movie, and that's again 2 active ways to watch a movie. I've heard people say, I go to movies just to shut my brain off. It's like, okay, well then you are actively choosing a little left hemisphere, narrow attention, where you don't have to think about anything. Whereas our clan, literally the 6 of us, watch a movie or a TV show or a podcast every night with dinner, and we talk nonstop about it, and we map it onto the world, the archetypes and which hemisphere is playing out in the show and how it could have gone better, how it reflects into our world. It's like that is sustained attention, because it is a whole conversation and sometimes it slows the movie down. But it's a really good exercise, is just to take what you've learned, even if it's just a meme to start, and to share it with somebody, and start talking about the little things that you learn in a day, to actually start paying to the right hemisphere of getting that sustained attention, rather than staying in the left, where it's really just within yourself, and then you're not sharing your mind, you're not sharing your efforts, and then there's no growth, because there's no other people. And that's where you get stuck in the positive dopamine feedback loop, and memory, and your memory starts to deplete, because just like the hippocampus, which Macy alluded to, if you, in taxi drivers, the hippocampus is the biggest because they're constantly using their mapping. And that's where 3D spatial, visuospatial mapping is in the hippocampus. They're constantly using it, so it's large and in charge. Whereas nowadays, we have the convenience of GPS, fast food. So we don't need to use our navigational skills as much. We don't have to use the things that would make life a little bit harder, and that can be a blessing. But over abused, which it is for especially our generation, then we end up, our right hemisphere paying the hippocampus on the right side just starts to deplete, and then we don't remember things, and then we're stuck in the left hemisphere mode of attention. So that was a really big, like, encompassing thing that all of you guys brought up. And we haven't, I was going to ask Dad to bring up the matter with things, but like that's a whole other.
I have a question.
Noah's here again.
When we're talking about almost like in the first chapter, he referred to how the hemispheres kind of like play a part in differentiating themselves, and then how we just described that with taxi drivers, where it's like, well, if you're continuously practicing this habit, it's just, there's some sort of expansion there. But to me, when I read that section, it's funny, he said most neurons fatigue. That is to say, they cease to respond when continuously stimulated. And I wondered why that was the case, because I was like, okay, so if I'm like continuously stimulating this, I don't know, neuron that's responsible or helps with the system of me being able to do 3-dimensional mapping over space, which is what the taxi drivers are doing, right? It's like that one's continuously stimulated. So is it therefore fatigue? Ceases to respond? It's like, I don't understand.
Okay, so let's actually put ourselves into the taxi driver driving around the city. So like you guys all know, when I'm cruising around with Mom, she'll put in an address and she'll throw up like the destination, new house or what have you. Most cases, I'm not always actually like paying attention to the voice that she's holding. I've already experienced the city of Calgary by driving around for various different jobs and various different things that I've had to do. So I'm actually bringing in my right hemisphere's like lived mapping of the terrain. What'll end up happening is that the one thing is that AI might chip in a path that it sees as, well, this is the most efficient, because once again, right, garbage in, garbage out. AI is all left hemisphere bias. It's, in other words, it runs like it tries to figure out the straightest arrow to any given point, thinking that that's the value structure. Whereas all of a sudden I'll be like, yeah, but at this time of day, and sometimes, you know, where traffic is and school buses and school zones, and how many lights, I can do this thing. Well, a taxi driver does that. Like, they've done it so much that it's literally gone from the right hemisphere over to the left hemisphere for fast inference and actualization. So it's actually demonstrating a representation of the right hemisphere's thought process. You get it?
Yes.
Before I go on with more screenshots, Kyle, was there a section that you had in mind, or?
Oh yeah, it actually plays off pretty decently off of what Mike just brought up. So if you go page
Oh, all of
40.
it just decently.
Okay, I am going. Page 40. Again, on hard. That was another one of my screenshots. This is great. Checking off the list. Okay, so
It's
possibility.
going to be the new versus the known.
Oh, this was also mine.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have it?
Yep.
Okay, cool. From this, it follows that almost every case, what is new must first be present in the right hemisphere before it can come into focus for the left. For one thing, the right hemisphere alone attends to the peripheral field of vision from which new experience tends to come. Only the right hemisphere can direct attention to what comes to us from the edges of our awareness, regardless of the side. Anything newly entering our experiential world instantly triggers a release of neuroadrenaline, mainly in the right hemisphere. Novel experience induces changes in the right hippocampus, but not the left. So it is no surprise that phenomenologically, it is the right hemisphere that is attuned to the apprehension of anything new. This difference is pervasive across domains, not just new experience, but the learning of new information or new skills. Also engages the right hemisphere attention more than the left, even if the information is verbal in nature. However, once the skills have become familiar through practice, they shift into being the concern of the left hemisphere, even for skills such as playing a musical instrument. If it is the right hemisphere that is vigilant for whatever it is that exists out there, it alone can bring us something other than what we already know. The left hemisphere deals with what it knows, and therefore prioritizes the expected. Its process is predictive. It positively prefers what it knows. This makes it more efficient in routine situations where things are predictable, but less efficient. But less efficient but less efficient than the right, wherever the initial assumptions have been revised. For when there is a need to distinguish old information from new material that may be consistent with it. Because the left hemisphere is drawn by its expectations, the right hemisphere outperforms the left whenever prediction is difficult. The link between the right hemisphere and what is new or emotionally engaging exists not just in humans, but already in higher mammals. For example, horses perceive the new possibility emotionally arousing stimuli with the left eye.
Left eye being right hhemisphere.
Yeah, the cross control, same thing with your handedness. But anyways, yeah, that section, again, played off really well from what Mike said. Anytime you experience something new, your right hemisphere begins grabbing as many possibilities and experiences and contexts as it can and brings them into the fold. And the left hemisphere's job is to start picking out individual tiny bits and start building its own scaffolding, a very mechanical version of what the right hemisphere has presented to it, so that it can start creating automatic processes and start making it as efficient as it thinks it can.
I found that interesting too, because it's even in the case, as it says here, with language, like new information, even when it's verbal, is still processed through the right hemisphere. So those who claim that all language is the left hemisphere's realm, it's like that's not necessarily the case. So everybody here.
Yeah, I just want to check something in. I just want to check something in here. This is why the emissary betrays the master.
Mm.
The minute that a meta pattern that the right hemisphere goes, now this large scope is a meta pattern and gets handed over to the left hemisphere into that realm, that's when the left hemisphere goes, I can think as the right hemisphere. But it can't. It never will. It never can. It does not, like period.
Mm.
And this is something that we don't understand this about ourselves. This is why we end up betraying ourselves. This is the Judas of our own mind. Because for 30 pieces, individuals, things of silver, you end up betraying a large segment of your moral constitution, the real world understanding of how to navigate. Are you going to chop this person's ear off too in rebellion? Like, I mean, there's so many facets that I can bring into this, but that's the formula. The left hemisphere literally formalizes the right hemisphere, and that's why it betrays. That's why the emissary thinks it can become the master.
So would you think I'm right about what I wrote in the chat then? Since like as of like what I'm understanding is that the left hemisphere is just like more of a lazy version of the right hemisphere in a way. Does that make sense?
No.
No? Okay.
The right hemisphere, I would say no. My understanding of this is not perfect, but the right hemisphere tends to grasp whole, and the left hemisphere tends to grasp parts.
You know, it's
So
really,
their modes of
this is a
attention
good
are just
section.
different. It's not like one's a lazy version of the other.
Right here's a good section that bridges right off of what Kyle said, and it kind of goes into what Noah's asking about, you know, some of the key differences here. If you look at this drawing that I have on screen, so this is a template on the left side, and this is patients that have a right hemisphere damage, so they're just relying on their left. And if you notice, they're missing half of the image on each template. So this is one of my screenshots, and we'll go a little bit into it. It is probably relevant that it is the right hemisphere that controls conjugate eye movements. That is, that makes the two eyes move together, leading to the interesting thought that it may be the right hemisphere that also keeps the hemispheres together in the interests of a whole world of experience, rather than allowing the left hemisphere willfully to go its own way. In summary, the hierarchy of attention, for a number of reasons, implies a grounding role and an ultimately integrating role for the right hemisphere, with whatever the left hemisphere does at the detailed level needing to be founded on, and then returned to, the picture generated by the right. This is an instance of the right, left, right progression, which will be a theme of this book, and it lies at the very foundation of experience, attention where the world actually comes into being. So that kind of builds off of what Carter was saying to you, Noah, is that this template right here is what the right hemisphere can encompass, because it includes this half, which is the left hemisphere's half. It includes the bits of the left hemisphere, but also the entire other image. So the right hemisphere is the whole. So I understand what you're saying by lazy, but Carter is right that it's still a bit too, that's still a reduction of the two of them. Mike, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, because however, Noah's not entirely, once again, not so how about incomplete? It's incomplete because the thing is that Noah's assessment is correct. That is the left hemisphere's word to describe the failing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, yep, that's partially correct. However, context needs to now enter into the equation because it's more than that. Like all those pictures that you showed there, the left hemisphere drew its reality. Okay, so like the one thing that it's, how does one say this? One of the things about this work that you guys are venturing into that I want to encourage all of you to understand is that this is you. Like you're no matter where you go, you and your brain, because there's so much nuances to the existence of oneself. But if the hemispheres that have a antagonistical relationship are constantly at work, this is why it's about trust more than it is about good and evil. Because good and evil is the left hemisphere's dichotomy of experience, is the left hemisphere's version of trying to understand the world. And it was given a formula, by the way, that like good and evil is not a, that got handed to it by something the right hemisphere was instinctively navigating. And the left hemisphere went, this is good, this is evil, this is good, this is evil. And the right hemisphere was like, well, the outcome of how we maneuver together in this circumstance does play out that way. And so therefore we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should, it's that one would be wiser to consider the whole, even though, like Noah had said, is this a laziness? And it's like, yes, there is some laziness here, because we as the individual have to understand both facets of us. Like, you cannot run away from your brain. It's the consistent factor. And then if you're going to be a God chaser, a spiritual chaser, what have you, your brain also plays a role in that. Is there some laziness in spirituality? Is there laziness in academia? Is there laziness in your discipline to train for, like Kyle, fighting? You know, it's like these are important dynamics that you can't just, it is not just categories. The left hemisphere loves categories, but you know damn well it ain't just that. There's more nuances. Now, when I say you know damn well, that's the right hemisphere. It's instinctual. It knows this. So you guys are making me regret that I didn't screenshot some matter of things, because I'm already on the next tomes. So, but one of the most intriguing aspects is the right hemisphere is the nurturing caregiver for the left hemisphere. This was something that I recently had written. I mean, not written, I'd read in Gilchrist news works in chapter 2, but it plays right into this because it's about attention. And yeah, it's important.
You can elaborate. Like, it's really good knowledge what you read at the table to us, and regarding the right and the left hemisphere, and even the fact that the left hemisphere's world, like you alluded to, people would look at left hemisphere thinkers or proclivity people in the moment would say the left hemisphere is evil, not understanding that's just the way the left hemisphere functions, which the matter with things he goes into, and he gives really good examples from these split brain patients. If you want to give a couple of those, Dad, like, because that section was like really interesting.
Well, Carter, you're upstairs, so look to your right. You're going to see the Matter with Things book that I'm busy chipping away at. So
You
when
want it?
you, you're going to do the reading, dog. So grab the book.
Okay, what are we reading?
Okay, so in that book, you'll see that I got a little bookmark in there. Now all right, so now you're going to have to move back a bit to the summary of chapter 2. So we will be patient with this page flipping process. My apologies for those that end up watching this downstream.
Yep, I got it.
So you see the summary offered?
Yep.
All right, read it for the class.
Okay. Attention does not just change things in some rather nebulous way. Attention is responsible not just for the how, though it is, not just for the what, though it is, but as far as the left hemisphere is concerned, for the whether at all of existence. What it doesn't attend to, as far as the left hemisphere is concerned, doesn't exist. Left hemisphere attention is sharply restricted in space and time, which is, after all, the four-dimensional world in which we live. It tends toward precision, but at the expense of depth. It is no longer true to the expansive, always moving, always changing, endlessly interconnected nature of reality. One way of putting it is that the left hemisphere can provide some sorts of knowledge about the world, as it would be scrutinized from a certain theoretical point of view effectively outside the realms of time and space, as on a map, whereas the right hemisphere provides us with the knowledge of the world in space and time, as experienced. Constraining attention, left hemisphere fashion, makes coherent wholes dissolve and brings things to a standstill. Reality leaches out. The left hemisphere's limited appreciation of depth in space and time is in keeping with its tendency towards stasis. It seems to lack appreciation, not just of motion, but of emotion. It relatively lacks appropriate emotional depth or concern, tending to be irritable or facetious, especially when challenged. It tends to disown problems and pass the responsibility to others. It is overconfident about what it cannot and the nature of things know much about, fabricates often improbable stories to cover its ignorance, sees parts at the expense of wholes, tends to see from the outside rather than experience from the inside. It has an affinity for the inanimate and for tools and machines in particular. It is also quite confident that it is right.
So the reason why that bears so much relevance is that this is you. You have to understand that you are navigating an existence where you think you know, which hemisphere thinks it knows. All too often, there is statements through my background in the religious community where it's like, go with God. Our family says the universe has a funny way of doing things. The reason why an individual can be comfortable with those statements is that it realizes there's a humility to that which it doesn't know. But make no mistake, the left hemisphere doesn't even allow that world to exist. This is where dogma comes from. This is where religious certainty comes from. Religious certainty and dogma is the left hemisphere. That's trying to pull into focus, left hemisphere, a reality of religiosity, a reality of like this is where the term hubris of youth comes from. This you haven't lived, experienced, taken all the punches. You haven't rolled on the mats. You know what I mean? Like Kyle's like, I remember when he first started and he would share his stories, and then they're not the same now. There's something else going on. There's more contextual information. I don't mean to speak for you, by the way. If anywhere in here I'm not doing you justice, you shut me down and you take over. And the thing is that this is something that we do. And if we don't understand that we do this as individuals, and then we do it to one another, so this is also a problem. This is when we decide that we want to project our left hemispheres onto others, and that we need to see Agent Smith everywhere. The Matrix gives you all those Agent Smiths for a reason. And the people that wrote it probably didn't even understand what that was. And that is the left hemisphere. It's looking everywhere for itself. And the right hemisphere is like, yeah, but you're not the end all be all of the lived experience. And if we navigate this with some humility and some willingness to understand that we as a humanity and as individuals that make humanity are going to get this wrong several times. But if we have some grace and we have some willingness to move forward cautiously and lovingly with one another, we can find our way through. We just got to get back to not letting the emissary be the master. Instead of the left, right, left dichotomy of pinging that we have in our world right now, like the aforementioned statement, there's more of a right, left, right type of pinging that needs to, we got to put the emissary back in his place.
Yeah, there's this section right here, which is one of my latter screenshots, and it goes into that left hemisphere categorization and it kind of trying to be the master, and how it's still important to take this book in the context of the world, not just split brain patient. So I'll just read this section here. It says, the systematic categorizing process of the left hemisphere can sometimes begin to have a life of its own. I have mentioned that networks of dopaminergic neurons are more widely distributed in the left hemisphere than the right. Excess dopaminergic transmission, which occurs in, for example, amphetamine abuse and in high-dose treatment with anti-Parkinson's drugs, can mimic aspects of schizophrenia because it tends to favor the left hemisphere over the right. In such circumstances, a sort of freewheeling need to collect and categorize, coupled with the left hemisphere's overriding concern with getting and making, is sometimes seen, known as punding, the mechanical and repetitive assembling and disassembling of machines, collecting and categorizing of inanimate objects, such as torches, TVs, stones, boxes, and so on. I once had a patient with schizophrenia who arranged and rearranged symmetrical structures of carefully collected commercial packaging. The resultant sculptures filled his living room. On one occasion, after he had spent the weekend at his flat, I asked him how he had got on. He replied dryly, "I moved some things to the right." A response that has considerable interest in view of the left hemisphere's strong bias to attend to the right side of space and disattend to the left. There is an asymmetry of hemispheric function in schizophrenia with an abnormal but overactive left hemisphere compared with the right. The passion for collecting and organizing is seen in other conditions, of course, including Asperger's syndrome, which also shows right hemisphere deficits. Don't think, though, that this categorizing drive has a life of its own only in people who we regard as ill. It's at work all the time in all of us. As Henry Maudsley put it, we have a sufficiently strong propensity not only to make divisions in knowledge, where there are none in nature, and then to impose the divisions on nature, making the reality thus comfortable to the idea, but to go further and to convert the generalizations made from observation into positive entities, permitting for the future these artificial creations to tyrannize over the actual understanding.
Conformable, not comfortable. Conformable is actually the more important word to get there.
Conformable? Oh, I see. Okay. So is that making sense for everybody here thus far? Cyril, Noah, Carter has
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, hold up. Go back to that quote.
It's starting to make sense.
Go back to the quote.
Okay.
Like one more time, because I screenshotted this one too, but like to me, I felt like my brain's still not latching on entirely, and that's what's funny because my left wants to latch on. But so hold on, can I read that one more time?
Yep.
Okay. A sufficiently strong propensity not only to make divisions in knowledge where there are none in nature, and then to impose the divisions on nature, making the reality thus conformable to the idea, but to go further and to convert the generalizations made from observation into positive entities, permitting for the future these artificial creations to tyrannize over the understanding. What are we getting from that? I kind of want to hear people's thoughts on that. Dad, go.
No, because you said people's thoughts, so others should,
Everyone,
because
you
I
can
can nail this.
It reminded me of what Carter and you, Dad, talked about earlier, which was good and evil. So it's like we have a sufficiently strong propensity not only to make divisions in knowledge where there are none in nature. So we call things good and evil where it might not always be that dichotomous, like the brain. People look at the right and left hemisphere, it's like good and evil. It's like it's not necessarily like that in nature, but we've put it on there, and now we've imposed the divisions on nature, saying that nature is good and evil, the brain is good and evil. Again,
Yeah,
not necessarily.
so this would be misallocating causality. This would, in a scientific experiment, this is where you're making the mistake that the outcome of your experiment, you were imposing the causality incorrectly.
Yeah, it's also the creation of dichotomies that don't really exist to try to categorize the world. And then once you have those dichotomies, forcing them onto everything else.
Well, okay, so yeah, so I applaud that, Carter. So the reason why I applaud that is that what happens then if we do that? This comes to the testimony of Goebbels in the Nuremberg. Tell the lie long enough, repeat it often enough, it becomes the perceived reality of the populace. So What you're doing then is you're creating the hall of mirrors. The left hemisphere has a false positivity bias of what it thinks it knows. And the right hemisphere is a silent objector, the devil's advocate. It's the no or absence of no. You'll hear that theme lots throughout this book. And so what ends up happening is that this self-perpetuated, it's a lie, gets repeated often enough, the left hemisphere imposes it as a truth. Now, the right hemisphere, being the healthy skeptic and encompasser of context, is willing to let the scrub nurse, the emissary, have its day in court, even if it's at the expense of the whole thing. Because the one thing that the right hemisphere knows is that even in spite of the whole thing, and it ends me as an individual, it doesn't end humanity as a whole. Because I am, we are the same thing to the right hemisphere. So this is why we, I, you, all, the wiser we become in letting the master be the master and putting our emissaries in its place. If we don't figure that out, we end up with division and war imposed. An imposition is a manipulation. It's the left hand grabbing hold of the situation. Now, we all know there's times when that has to happen. Okay. If you've been in a fight, you know this. If you have had a boss that you know they're not making decisions that are in the best interest of the whole project. Like, there's so many life circumstances that I can toss out there, and everybody in all these little cubicles are going to understand this from their own worldview. And anybody who would watch this from this time forward, they're going to get it. And so this is the thing, is that this is why the individual is so important in relationship to the collective. It's the balance of the hemispheres. When the master is the master and the emissary is the emissary, the procedure goes so much smoother. But when you decide to go left, right, left, and you let the emissary run its imposter declaration and impose its version of the master upon the master's, this is why everybody gives conservatives a hard time about, well, we just let it. No, it's the devil's advocate. The reason why conservatives just let it happen is because they're giving the devil its due, because there's some knowledge to be garnered. That doesn't mean it's always right. Sometimes you actually really want the left hemisphere to be like, no, there is a time for this thing. And this is the relationship. This was what lays within all of us. The better we get this understanding sorted out, as Gilchrist is going to continue. I love that this is just chapter 2. There's so much more.
Yeah, that's one of the things I enjoyed, because in the first one, Carter alluded to this, so did Jeremiah, about how he just gives all these teasers and really good concepts. And we talk about, as Carter also alluded to, how he's using, like, this is a neuropsychological philosophy way of going about it. And chapter 2 is really dense heavy with physical examples. So if some people, have a hard time mapping onto the broader context of the world, or they just haven't done enough thinking about it, that these are practical examples in actual schizophrenic patients or people that they've done the inhibition on either side of the hemisphere, to actually get examples of all of this greater stuff, but on example levels, like what you just alluded to, Dad. I have another screenshot. Anybody can jump in before I go there. That plays into what you were talking about.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good point, Mike, because we do need our left hemisphere to be able to filter out stuff that's obviously not true. Like, if you want your left hemisphere, somebody says it's morally justified to microwave kittens. You want your left hemisphere to be able to say no. You don't need your right hemisphere considering this idea, weighing over the pros and cons, seeing how it affects the world as a whole. You need to be able to just say, no, that microwaving kittens is wrong.
Oh my
So if
God.
you can-
So I totally agree with this statement so much
Yeah.
so because in a matter of things, the next double tome that he brings up,
Yeah.
there's this, and you want to know the funny thing about what you just said is that there is a millifractional. So when it comes to individuals that study the brain think the left hemisphere has an advantage because it responds first. So therefore they think that it has the priority. And the reason this is once again, this is the wrong causality. The reason why the left hemisphere responds a little bit quicker by a millimeter second faster than the right is what you just said, is that the right hemisphere takes into context the statement and goes, is it advantageous to fry a kitten in a microwave? Okay, it's just, I was laughing in the background. He literally just echoed there. But the thing is like, you are absolutely correct. But I'm in the middle of this chapter in his next, because he breaks down more. And the thing is that you are correct. You don't necessarily need the right hemisphere to go, I wonder if moving a bunch of Canadians into gas chambers is beneficial for climate change. Yeah, like this is the kind of thing that you're like, yeah, that's okay. We should let the left hemisphere have its voice in this circumstance and go, not just no, hell no.
Yeah, if the right hemisphere has a coherent moral knowledge and can understand the whole thing as a situation, then it's easy for the left hemisphere to snap that into place and say, no, we're not doing this. That only comes through taking into account the morality of the whole. If you apply things morality abstractly, without considering the whole and all the consequences, then your left hemisphere is not going to be able to do that. Or if it does, then it won't know why it's doing that.
Karen, any other thoughts before I bring up the screenshot?
I think you should bring up the screenshot. That's my thought.
This is another real life example about what we've all been talking about, the two hemispheres, their mode of attentions and how they operate in the world based off of their fundamental attentions. Yeah, okay, this is it. This is really on language, which might appeal to Cyril and Noah. Whereas close lexical semantic relationships rely more on the left hemisphere, looser semantic associations rely on the right. Because the right hemisphere makes infrequent or distantly related word meanings available, there is increased right hemisphere involvement when generating unusual or distantly related words or novel uses for objects. This may be one of many aspects that tend to associate the right hemisphere with a freer, more creative style. The right anterior temporal region is associated with making connections across distantly related information during comprehension, and the right posterior superior temporal sulcus may be selectively involved in verbal creativity. In the close situation, by contrast, the left hemisphere actively suppresses the right to exclude associations which are semantically only distantly related. The more flexible style of the right hemisphere is evident not just in its own preferences, but also at the meta level, in the fact that it can also use the left hemisphere's preferred style, whereas the left hemisphere cannot use the right hemisphere's. For example, although the left hemisphere gains more benefit from a single strong association than several weaker associations, only the right hemisphere can use either equally. So again, that goes right back to what Noah was talking and asking about, is like the lazier version. It's like yes and no. It's just that little, it's the base information, but this big broader context about the right hemisphere, it can use the left hemisphere when it needs to, which is, he goes into that later, and I think he's already alluded to it, kind of given us teasers that in when you look at all these split brain patients, If you have left hemisphere deficit, meaning you're relying mainly on your right, you can still function as like a relatively normal human being for the most part. However, flip the script, and if you have right hemisphere damage, the left hemisphere on its own cannot like reasonably function with other people in and around the world. It has a seriously difficult time doing so.
It can't reason. Like a little funny anecdote. You guys are all maybe not Cyril. You guys are familiar with Looney Tunes, where you see the whole like devil on one shoulder and you get an angel on the right talking to, and then you always get the devil character whacking the angel character. Why is that?
It's the left hemisphere
That's
suppressing the right.
exactly. It's so this plays out in reality. This is one of the reasons why that whole, oh, but temptation is so difficult. It's like, well, yes, because it's active first.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, that's it. And the funny thing is that if you actually take a page out of I've been married for, I'm coming up on my silver wedding anniversary, 25 years. All right. So for my generation, that's a rare thing to accomplish. But the one thing is that you listen to either side on your shoulders, say what they say. And the one thing you understand is if you're just patient with yourself before you act on that impulse, you find yourself with every moment that you're patient, like even if you just sit in it, don't respond. You've got the temptation. It's there. It's in your face. Why wouldn't it be in your face? That's why it's called temptation. It's in your face. And it appeals to the left hemisphere. All you have to do is sit back and go, fair enough, it's in my face. And just that one word, and you've expanded the temptation. Well, the minute that an expansion of a temptation occurs, left hemisphere loses. It doesn't do that thing. It doesn't do expansion. It does division. It does reduction. It does gratification. It does the F off to the other side, whack it, pulls the halo off the dog on the other shoulder and smacks it in the head. Anybody who's watched Warner Brothers would see that. This is the suppression of the left, because the one thing, the left hemisphere, the minute that it finds itself in no man's land, anger, violence, and fear are why it taps into. You guys eventually will get through this book, and I would encourage that you go into the Matter with Things, that Gilchrist's new volume 1 and 2. And the reason being is that when you get to really understand that this is what you are, you find yourself going, I can beat this. I've always been able to beat this. Like right from the beginning, I was always able to beat this. I just get to communicate it because I'm a little bit silver in tooth and hair and time versus everyone on this podcast. But the thing is that this is a reality. When you actually find yourself going, all right, fair enough, I'm in the situation where I got the suppression of the left hemisphere is going to beat down the right. And it's very good at it, might I add. Very, very good at it. I know I have a whole plethora of a story that we don't talk on. We don't talk about Fight Club. It's like, yeah, I got that. I got that in my past. And it's like, yeah, fair enough. I know this. So now I get to sit back and try to communicate and help encourage you guys and those that come after and go, there were scenarios where I did think a little bit longer when the left hemisphere decided to want to beat down, suppress. I went, I'm going to let my devil's advocate have its say, where Carter's like, there's times that you don't. I agree with the statement. And there's times where you do. That's the balance. This is the symmetry between the hemispheres. They are the orchestra. When they play beautiful music together, all of us not just tap our foot, because the left hemisphere likes tapping the foot, Yeah, all right. Go to the club. And then you get Beethoven. Then you get Amadeus. Then all of a sudden something else is happening. And that's something else. That's where the right hemisphere goes. Yeah, but there's something else. So when you realize that about yourself and you demonstrate this thing, you find yourself becoming the better version of yourself. Not complete, but a better version of yourself.
Does anybody have any last screenshots or pages that they wanted to go over, either as interests or questions before I go around the room?
I don't think so, Maddie. I think I've got mine pretty much covered, or other people covered aspects of it that are more interesting. So
Yeah, I agree. That was kind of cool how everybody's screenshots, like pretty much we were all aligned on the same page. That was kind of cool.
Same page. Wow.
I also think it's a good note on how excellent the author is. It's like the book is self-referential, where you take a section from later on, bring it back to the start, and it's enforcing itself throughout the entirety of the entire book. It's like, I love his analogy of the I don't know how to say it. Is it gestalt or gestalt?
Just
Like
the
like the grand complete piece of a painting.
Gestalt.
adult.
Yeah, and so like his entire book, he even says in the introduction that that's kind of how he wants to conduct the whole thing. Even in this chapter, he says, this is the longest chapter in the book. I could have broken it up, but I want to get away from that broken up individual bit by bit type of thinking. And I want to try and get people looking at this as more of a grand one entirety, a whole. I already forgot the way it's said, but you know, the full piece, the big picture, the and.
Now I'm gonna go around the room, because what we're gonna do is we're all gonna exercise sustained attention, which is what we've been doing over this whole call. And I want to tap into everybody's right hemisphere. Tell me something that you learned that was new. It can be your favorite thing from tonight, or maybe something you still don't understand. And then everybody will have pinged a little bit more than they did at the beginning or before this podcast into the right hemisphere about takeaways. So I'm going to go around the room, and I'm going to start with Carter.
Ooh, good question. What was that one we were just talking about right before? It was about how the left hemisphere can't use the right hemisphere's mode of attention, but the right can use the left. I guess
the language.
Yeah, I think what sunk in for me too with that is that's such a good proxy for how we can approach our interpersonal relations too. If we can learn how to communicate on other people's level without having to depend on them to communicate our way, then we're going to be so much more successful. Like the same thing is true with how we think as well. So I guess on a micro scale, how does our brain work? And then on a macro scale, transmitting that out to everybody else. It's an interesting metaphor for how things play out in reality, which I think is what we're all trying to do here. Understanding the brain is only as useful as how we're able to apply it and use it in reality, which I am aware is a left hemisphere thing, but if we leave it on the level of theory, it's not going to be any good for us.
No, that's a very right hemisphere thing. Is actually
I don't think that's left at all, but
that was really good. That was good. Anybody else feel called? They have something on the tip of their tongue. I'll take that as a no, and I'll appoint the next person. Macy, I'm going to appoint it to you.
Okay. This is tricky because to me, what Kyle said really is true. Like the first chapter, the intro, and now the first half of the second chapter, they're all so interconnected. So my brain has done that thing that he talked about where it's like, I have something, and then I forgot. And I was like, I had something, and I was like, oh shit, because we were just flowing. But I think that I'm glad that you clarified, Maddie, in terms of that quote where you think that it's a division of nature in terms of if you see something that is imposed as good or bad, but you're not actually relating it into the context of, well, nature is as nature does, like almost like stupid is as stupid does. It's like we call it this thing stupid, right? But what it is a process, is it's a living thing, right? And then we recognize it as something, as this pattern. And then the left hemisphere, I think I definitely have gotten a better grasp left hemisphere term of the left, right, left ping, because then it's like the left, right, left, right ping, where then the right hemisphere is recognizing things for what they are, and the left is like, well, this is what it is, like this is what I think it is, like it's this, right? And then the right hemisphere uses the tools of the left, and it's like, yeah, okay, and then expand upon that a bit more, because it's not just that, but you're partially right, hence two things are true at the same time. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
That's a good takeaway. That's a good takeaway. Okay, Cyril, you're up next.
I missed. No, to me, there was two kind of interesting things. It was like the mapping. So once you learn enough about something, it eventually becomes like the left hemisphere. So eventually, if you gather enough information about this one thing, like the Calgary, for example, right? Once you learn to drive around it, eventually it's just like, oh, get to Deerfoot, okay, take Deerfoot to this and stuff like that. And then another interesting thing to me was the fact that like someone with only a right hemisphere can actually function like a normal human being ish, but someone with only a left can't. That was kind of interesting to me as well. I don't know, could you hear me, that whole blabber?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's kind of the interesting parts to me.
Both
Nice.
good picks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Kyle, you're up next.
Cool. I don't remember if it was touched on, but it's just, don't worry about pulling up the page. It's only like 2 sentences, but it just shows how, like, you do these split brain studies to see how each hemisphere behaves on its own without the other playing a role. So you can kind of weed out what's responsible for what, or what has a tendency to bias against whatever else. But there was a very, very small little bit that he brings up, like on the second page of the chapter, that shows almost an anatomical hint that that's the way that the hemispheres conduct themselves before you even get into the split brain parts. And it's where he says the ratio of gray matter also differs. The finding that there is more white matter in the right hemisphere facilitating transfer across regions also reflects its attention to the global picture, where the left hemisphere prioritizes local communication transfer of information within regions. So it on the anatomical level, it's kind of cool that you can even see that the left hemisphere is more self-referential representation, and the right hemisphere is actually designed to start drawing lines and helping the other parts of the brain connect and pulling things in, rather than just constantly this internal loop of communication.
And remind some of us here what gray matter does. Like, what's the significance of there being more gray matter in the right hemisphere versus the left?
That's a good question.
I'm doing that more for the audience, for those who
Yeah.
don't know the context of what gray matter is. The myelin sheath.
It's like a mechanism of interconnectivity. So it's like the substance that makes up the connections and bridges within the structure of the brain is my basic understanding.
Yeah. I thought that was one of the coolest things when we read it the first time too, the fact that the right hemisphere has more of the gray matter, literally meaning it has more almost mentation, like it's got more neural activity because it's got more responsibility. And that's another thing that McGilchrist used that word in the first chapter. He said responsibility, our ability to respond to things, and the right hemisphere has more responsibility because it's got more on its plate, which is why it has more gray matter.
It actually, and I'm going to expand upon that, right hemisphere style, it has a higher potentiality. So the funny thing about the gray matter is it's neither black nor white. It's either or, and either or. It's potentiality. This is us, baby. Either or. Always.
Either and or. Okay. Noah, what was your takeaway?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had a like while I was reading, I had like a harder time like trying to understand the difference between like the left and the right hemisphere, but I think I finally got it when Mike was explaining like the example of like the taxi driver where that it's using like more like the left hemisphere to get where it needs to go, where it's like very like a very simple outline of what you have to do, whereas like the right hemisphere you're going more based on memory and like knowing your city. So yeah, I thought that was cool.
Mm. Like the actual, yeah, usefulness. That's another thing that he expands upon is the left hemisphere's utility, like you said. Like it just needs to get where it wants to go. So it's only concerned with what it can physically use.
Yeah,
to
versus
get
versus
full.
versus a lived experience. Like if you've done the
That's
route so many times, you want to know what? Just for shits and giggles, for those that end up watching this, a little fun film that kind of plays that out in written and then put into a movie is the movie Collateral with Tom Cruise, Jamie Foxx. Jamie Foxx plays a cab driver, and there's a point where he has Jada Pinkett Smith's character in the back seat, and he has done LA so many times that he knows how many lights, what the odds are that he's going to be able to get to his destination sooner rather than her. She made a left hemisphere response. Yeah, you should be taking this way. And he's like, yeah, but if you do that at this time of day, you're going to end up not getting to where you want to go by a certain time. This is the epitome of the right left hemisphere dichotomy. Left hemisphere goes, but it's this. Right hemisphere goes, yeah, but it's only that at this time.
why
But that's not this always.
like rush hour. You know what I mean? That sounds like something that would be coming up because you're paying attention to your surroundings. Like, oh, it's rush hour. You know why? Because people are coming back from work, and that's context, and that's so cool.
That was nice. Good. Well put too, Noah. That was a good ping. Mike.
All right. So I like that you guys are doing this. I learn from you guys learning. I'm older, longer of tooth. I die first. This is the reality of existence. So if this is going to end up being seen by more than just the people that are a part of this podcast, I hope that you understand that there are young minds trying to navigate their minds. This is good. This is really good. Doesn't mean everybody makes it. The one thing about what's facing everybody in the world that we're in today is there is a reverse correlation. And what I mean by this is when we decide to look back into history and we have heroes that we gravitate towards, whether it's a Homer's Iliad, a Bible, Confucian dialogues, Plato, Augustus, different Caesars, like I don't care, pick your hero. We're getting this individual and circumstances where maybe they transcended. What about all the people that didn't? This is the reality of existence. As much as I love gospels and I love different texts throughout the known world, what I love about these types of scenarios, and I'm very humbled to be a part of it, is that this is where I was driving around earlier having a conversation with Maddie about the part where the youth, you guys don't know shit. Like, let's keep it real. You don't know shit. But the potential of what you can know, this is everything. This is why I want to serve you guys. This is why I hope we can find our way through what we're facing in the world today. There's a lot of existential things going on. And I hope more people wake up to the context, the right hemisphere ping, that there's a lot of things going on and that you are completely capable of figuring this out. Not just all the fun squares that we're all looking at on a Zoom meeting right now, of which I'm humbled and honored to share. But now, what about the unknowns? I worked on the drilling rigs for 17 years, and I do not know the lives of every man that I impacted. But I know that I went out of my way every day to want to do something positive for every one of those men and few women, toxic masculinity, that I got to work with. And I hope that it plays out well for all of them. And I hope it plays out well for all of you. So the part about tonight's podcast that I am enthralled by is that all these squares staring into the camera are trying to figure out their brains. If you figure out your brain, you're going to do better at negotiating yourself. If you do better at negotiating yourself, you're going to do better at helping the world around you. Like, we all leave the screens, and then there's something real going on in the world, and you're going to do this thing. I really, really want you to do well at doing this thing. And I hope that everything that we're reading, and will continue to do so, and as long as I am capable of being able to show up when this happens, I'm looking forward to all the extra thoughts that everybody brings to the table. This is what excites. I have a proclivity for right hemispheric thinking. So your guys' individual newness, it attracts me like a moth to a flame. Awesome.
Okay, now before we close this off, I want to say two things. One, thank you, Carter, Kyle, Cyril, Noah, for joining, even though you were late. Thank you. Mike, Macy, thank you for coming. And before I have one of you, I am hoping to, at the very beginning, Macy did the task of doing a synopsis, what we talked about last time and what chapters 1 and 2 were about, the 30 pages. This time we covered the first 30 pages of chapter 2. And for the next recording, I'm hoping somebody will do another little synopsis about what we talked about here today and what the first 30 pages, just for those who might not have gotten around to watching it. It's nice for the podcast. Matthew Arrett does it every time for his lectures. So is there somebody here that is willing to do a short synopsis for the next recording about what we did here today and what we read?
So from pages 30 to 60?
Yes, 30 to 60, what we read, what we talked about, yes.
Sure, yeah, I can do it.
Okay, Carter has told himself. Thank you. And
we are going to hold your ass accountable. But thank you for doing this thing.
Yeah. Don't expect anything less.
Yeah, we did vote on Macy's whether it was worthy enough, and most of us said it was worthy. So we will do.
Yeah, here.
It was right down to the wire, but it was still due anyway.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And till next time.
Adios.